Today's episode of Filmmaker U is brought to you by our sponsors OWC. Go to owcdigital.com for all your filmmaking and computer needs. And it's also brought to you by our other sponsors, AJA. Make sure to check out aja.com so that you can see how they can help you in your post-production needs.
Hi, I'm Gordon Raquel from Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses to deepen and diversify your existing skill set. You can learn more at filmmakeru.com, or of course, follow us on Twitter at filmmaker_u. Every week, we interview film professionals to discuss their work. And this week, I'm joined by editor Yvette Amirian, whose work includes Whale Wars, LA Burning 25 years later, and more recently, The Integrity of Joseph Chambers. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the Integrity of Joseph Chambers is very much tone and like sitting in tone. So how do you like to approach tone when you're editing? Like, how do you, especially something like this where he's kind of, there's like some, I don't want to call it comedic, but like moments like the truck backing up 17 times or whatever it is, but you also want to keep it serious. So how do you find those balances? How do you like to work with tone, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, the first step for me is always obviously reading the script and then discussing it with the director, like multiple times, because Robert Machoian, the director, and I were in constant communication about how far we wanted to take certain things. So for anybody who's seen the film, or for anybody who hasn't, the main character goes on a hunting trip but doesn't really know what he's doing, has never hunted alone, isn't really qualified to be doing what he's doing out there. And there are moments where we needed to make him, make it clear he doesn't know what he's doing. So there was times where we felt like maybe we were pushing that too far and we had to hold back. And there were times, like you said, with him backing up the truck and everything, we had to make it clear that this guy's a little bit of a goofball, isn't the type of person who really should be out there doing this thing. So that was a lot of playing around with it. And the first step was like taking it as far as we possibly could and then looking at the whole thing and going, okay, now we're going to pull back here. We're going to pull back here. We didn't do a lot with sound design in the offline. We kept it very simple. We added backgrounds, we added the obvious sounds that were supposed to be there. But Peter Albrechtson, our sound designer, and Will Fritsch, our composer, really took it to another level with their sound design and their music. And I feel fortunate that I had a chance to work with that after they had done a couple of passes to really kind of hone that in and make sure that we had it right.
Now, you talked about pushing it to its limit. So like I think about his sort of, I don't want to say his goofiness but his like naivete of things at the start. Like, was there stuff that you removed from that like, what were some of the things that you removed?
Like there was an entire scene that was taken out that wasn't working, but at the beginning of that scene, there's like a little bit with his seatbelt. He couldn't get his seatbelt on right. For example, there was another section with him like loading the gun. There was more of that we could have played, but we really chose that take because it was the one that without cutting, you could really kind of see how clearly he was doing it. So there were little things. It wasn't like huge things, but or him like getting lost in the woods and kind of running around. There was a section of that we pulled back on. So it wasn't anything that was like super, there wasn't anything more than what we had in terms of content. It was just more of it. And so at a certain point, it felt like we're doing it too much. Okay, we got the point. So it was like, once you got the point, you wanted to be able to move on. And I do think we got it, just right the way we have it now.
Well, that's why I was asking, because it's always that interesting balance of like, because if you push it too far, people will be like, this guy's an idiot. Why would anyone let him go out? So I'm always interested in like, what were the choices? Like, why did you choose the seatbelt as opposed to something else in the scene?
The seatbelt, for example, like was part of a bigger scene that whole scene we felt like was dragging down the film. So that had to go. And so the seatbelt had to go. It all took place in like another location. And I think what we really decided on, because we always talked about the film as like 2 or 3 parts, right? The first part was like, it's just a normal movie. You feel like it's just a guy who's about to go hunting in the woods. It's not until you get him into the woods that you start to realize like, okay, wait, we're getting a little bit in his head. We're starting to see, what he's thinking. And then the third part is obviously after this big, incident happens, that there's this huge tonal shift. But, you know, as we were trying to get him out into the woods, which is where the movie really begins, we found the faster we could get him there, the better. So anything that felt like dead weight dragging that down, we decided to, you know, do away with.
Now, the director, Robert, in an interview, talked about the tone, and he said that that you two wanted to do it in measured increments, so like slowly. How, like, can you elaborate on that? Like, I've never heard a director say it that way, or I want to understand like what this approach was.
That was part, I mean, what I was just saying was part of it, like the idea of like it's a film in kind of like these three parts. So the first part, you know, we had to make sure that both in terms of the way we were cutting it and the way that it was being sound designed, which, like I said, was more of a Peter and Will thing. But you didn't want to give away, like, there's something up with this movie, there's something that's going to happen. You didn't want anything too foreboding. So, you know, it was really covered in a kind of proper way. There was nothing, you know, crazy about the way it was covered. It was, you know, just regular 2-person camera coverage. And, you know, more importantly, that was the only part of the film where there were really there were any other characters in the film. Like, he's on his own the majority of the movie. So you didn't have as much of that naturally. So that first part of it, we wanted it to feel, for lack of a better terminology, normal. We wanted it to feel like a normal movie. And then when he gets into the woods, that's when we started, you know, you held on those longer, wider shots. We had the coverage where we could have gone in and done other things. We held on those wider, longer pieces. We really let him sort of play in the woods. You wanted to get the sense that he's sort of like this little kid, you know, out in the middle of nowhere, not really, you know, knowing what he's doing. And he's just sort of bouncing around and really excited that he's on his own. And then you had to start to feel like he feels like, okay, I'm getting bored. This is not happening. I can't find any deer to hunt. You know, this is not happening for me. And you have to start to feel that frustration with him. So there was very much a measured way of doing it. And like I said, there was more of it that we could have done. You know, there was a version where we had more of him getting bored, more of him getting frustrated, and pulling back on that helped to get to, again, like the next moment of the film, which is obviously that big, I don't want to give away anything.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it was very measured. And then once that incident happens, then it's like, okay, you have to feel every decision that he's making. And that was a big thing that Robert wanted, was, especially for me, anytime I suggested, like, maybe we pull this out or maybe we take that out, there was always this, you know, feeling on his part of, but I want the audience to see the decisions he's making, why he's making the decisions he's making. We really wanted you to feel like, what would you do if you were in this person's position? So I think maybe that's what he was talking about. I don't remember the interview that you're referring to. I listened to a lot of interviews that
it was in Variety. It was in the Variety.
Oh yeah. I remember that now. Yeah. So I think that's probably what he was referring to. But tonally, in terms of the sound design, that was also something that was reflected, where it rolls out in these tiny increments. Like, it doesn't. There's a section in the film, for example, where he's sitting up in a deer stand. You know, he's hunting, trying to see, you know, where's the deer going to come out. And when he gets to the top, there's like this applause, and it's supposed to be, you know, in his head, you know, he feels proud of himself. And that's something that echoes throughout the film. And that was something that, you know, when we first did it, it was like you had to do it in one place for it to pay off in another bigger scene later. So they had to do that in these tiny increments so that it wasn't just suddenly like, oh my gosh, like there's an audience in the background in this giant scene. Where did that come from? Oh, that's right, we heard it earlier. So totally, it was something that they set up early on as well for things like that.
Now, you mentioned briefly earlier about you didn't do like the sound design, you didn't do as much sound design work in your timeline. You know, when I talk to editors, some love to do the sound design, like they find it as a fun thing to do or a part of their role as the editor, in terms of obviously not the full sound design, but in their timeline. And others prefer to leave it off for the assistant to do, or the assistant to do most of the bulk of the work. How do you like to approach sound?
I am definitely of the former classifications. I love doing sound design and music. I come from a documentary background, and for anybody who's cut documentaries or unscripted, it plays such a pivotal role in creating the tone that you're setting. So I also like didn't have a traditional like assistant editor on this, because it was a smaller independent film. So I was doing a lot of that. I did have an assistant editor, but he wasn't working with me. It was also during the pandemic, so we weren't like in a space together where we would be passing things back and forth. but for me, I did everything on my own in terms of, backgrounds, basic noises, any of the things that Robert wanted to try to see how it would work. At one point we had put music in, we realized that didn't work, as well as we had like a more traditional cue. And that didn't work the way that he had wanted it to. So we pulled that out. And when I gave it to Peter, like I said, they took it to like this whole new level, and they gave me a version of it. It wasn't our locked picture. It was like our pre-locked picture. It was like maybe 2 versions before we finally locked. And so I had all the sound design that he and Will had done. And based on that, we were able to go through and say, okay, now this feels too long. This feels like it could be expanded. And then they finished the sound on that version that we locked. So I generally like to do the sound design myself, but in this case, and again, for anybody who's seen Peter's other work, like with Killing of Two Lovers, which was a film that he and Robert did together, sound plays a bigger role, I think, in their films than most, like, most average movies. It's just something that you can't, like me having done the applause thing, for example, I wouldn't have been able to do it the way Peter did it, because he's really shifting the perspective in a really unique way, and he's doing all these crazy things. And Peter really, really loves sound design. He loves experimentation, which I love about him. So it was one of these things where every time I would put something in that would like push it to another limit, the response was just take it out. Peter's gonna, kind of do it. So it wasn't that they didn't like what I was doing. It was just like, he's gonna strip it out anyway. It was more of like a don't waste your time kind of a thing. Well, which I appreciated, because we didn't have like a ton of time. But generally, yes, I love experimenting with sound design if they'll let me.
It's interesting though, because it makes me think that it's almost like it sounds like he has a huge respect for the different roles, in the sense of like back in the day where it'd be like, you're the editor, don't worry about the sound, just give me a good story. Yeah. Now, you talked about experimenting with sound, but did you do experimenting with the picture edit at all? Like, is there any? What were some of the things you guys tried out?
So one of the primary things that we struggled with was there's a section where he is the section where he's sort of getting frustrated and bored. That went through a lot of different versions. There was even a point where, we were kind of frustrated that it wasn't coming together the way it had been written in the script. And so I asked Robert to sort of leave me alone with it a bit, and, pushed it around. He was really pleased with that outcome and how well that turned out. And then we went through another version of it where it was like, well, it still feels too long. So there was a lot of reshuffling things around, which is, again, I think where my unscripted experience comes into play, because you have to do that all the time when you're creating a documentary, is restructuring, reshuffling. So I'm really accustomed to doing that. It doesn't scare me in any way. So that was really fun to get to experiment with that. There were sections of the film, like I said, toward the end, especially when you're seeing like kind of a play-by-play of every single thing he's doing. We had more of that. We took a bunch of that out because we wanted to jump time a little bit more. And then of course, like there's like a really big cut in the movie that sort of shifts where you are in terms of time and space. That was really fun to experiment with.
Yeah. Now, because you talk about, you've done documentaries, you've done fiction. And usually when I talk to people, they're like, oh yeah, I've learned all this stuff from documentary I brought over to fiction. But is there something that you've learned from fiction that you bring over to documentary editing?
I think, like with fiction editing, especially in the early stages, it's so much more gratifying, because you're like going through dailies and you're just sort of like, things are coming together. And with unscripted, it takes a long time for anything to come together, because oftentimes you're missing pieces. You could be, whittling away for 2 weeks on a scene, but it's not really a scene because you're missing archival, because you're missing interviews. So I brought like a lot of patience with me, I think, from unscripted into scripted. And I think with scripted, I think maybe I actually haven't like done a documentary or unscripted thing since I've done fiction in a while. But I think the one thing that I would bring into it is that, you're sort of like fine-tuning moments or pacing is something that you work on a lot more on the side of things, especially when it comes to like dialogue scenes or people kind of conversing with each other. So that's something that I would imagine would be really fun to bring into the unscripted world.
Now you also teach at USC, and I'm wondering, what is something that you felt when you were just coming into the industry needed to be taught to young people, like something that was missing that you think is beneficial that you've been teaching some of the students?
I think one of the things that I really like to focus on is, and I do this partly by like the guest speakers that I bring in, or just me being able to talk to the students, is I didn't feel going into the real world like I had a real sense of what is my life going to look like? You know, the fact that I was gonna be a freelancer, the fact that, you know, you weren't always going to have a job. It was going to be like job to job, sort of the realities of how things were going to work. I didn't have a good sense of that. And speaking to my peers who, you know, have kind of come up with me, they didn't either. So I think that's something that the industry as a whole has really changed. I think there's a lot of mentorship, a lot of internships, you know, like particularly through ACE, for example, which I'm a member of, and even through USC, like they have developed their alumni programs in such an extensive way since I was there even. So that, and I think as professionals, we are a generation that really, in my experience, like wants to be able to give back, wants to be able to help people in the way that we needed that help. So that's just something personally I love. Like I love being able to answer questions for people. I love being able to give advice that hopefully helps my students. So that I think was like a big thing as far as like the industry is concerned. I don't know if you meant something like more on a technical side of things, but.
No, I was just thinking, you know, because sort of like what you were saying, like when I entered the industry, there wasn't really internship programs. It was sort of like, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you were like, I guess I'll start knocking on doors and seeing what happens.
Yeah.
So
we also didn't have social media. We didn't have to get in touch with people. We had like that little LA 411 book, like you would have to flip through and like call the production companies and, are you looking for interns?
Yeah.
You know?
We had in Toronto, we have the phone book, but it's spelt with an F instead of PH. So, and same thing, you would literally just buy the book and be like, page 1, let's start calling everyone.
Yeah, exactly.
So now, jumping back to your documentary work, one of the things that I find interesting about documentaries is that it can be very heavy content. And so I'm always interested when I talk to editors, how do you deal with that? Because you don't want to take that home with you. And it is something that can affect you emotionally and mentally. So how do you tackle stuff with heavy content?
I've certainly worked on things with heavy content. Unfortunately, I don't think it's something that you can like get away from. One of the things that I try to do is if I worked on something really heavy tonally is maybe the next one isn't as heavy, like be a little more intentional and not to, or like I'll just take a break or something like that. But it you know, I don't know, documentaries especially, I mean, like you can argue that Integrity of Joseph Chambers was a heavy subject matter, but it's a fiction, you know, like it's not something that touches you in as heavy a way as say like Whale Wars, which is about whales being killed. Like it's an awful thing to watch and have to deal with every day. I think there is a little bit of like feeling like I'm telling an important story, I'm helping get an important story out there. So there is like a little bit of that I'm doing some tiny little bit of good in the process, which is nice to focus on. But it doesn't really help solve the issue, but it's something that I try to focus on a little bit more when I'm working on documentaries, because I do feel like I, in the history of my career, have tried to focus on stories that are really important to me or that I think are important to the world in getting out there. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it's always interesting, especially like I think about, you talked about, you know, Joseph Chambers. You know, one of the things I remember, I was working with in a place and I was editing in one room and they were editing a horror movie in the next room, you know, and they immediately yell cut, and like the person who's dead on the ground like goes whoop, and you know, it's like talking, and so it's like there is this removed sense of reality. Like it's really weird. Same with like there's no sound effects, so it's not really scary. Whereas you know, in another time I was working in a place and someone was working on a documentary about a genocide, and it was just like, that's sort of when that peaked in my head. I'm like, how do you deal with this information? Like, you know, and the footage. So
yeah,
it's always interesting.
In documentary, I mean, like editing fiction particularly is a little more, in my experience, solitary, where it's just sort of like you and the director, you know, one-on-one, or you and your assistant. Editing documentaries, oftentimes, especially like on bigger studio documentaries, I'll have like an editing partner, or I'll have like a team around me, story producers, supervising producers, people like that, and the director. So you're kind of like always together.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of information and ideas being bounced around. You're not sort of figuring it out as much by yourself, which is nice when you're carrying something heavy like that around. And it's also like easier to talk through, like, well, what feels good, what makes sense, what is okay and not okay to touch on. So
the other big question I like to ask doc editors is, like when we look at a fiction film, there is a sense of pacing built into the footage because the actor's going to repeat it. They have that sort of sense of timing. Whereas when you look at a documentary, you might have shots of people walking, you might have interviews, you might have all this stuff that has different rhythms to it. So how do you like to approach building a sense of pace to your projects?
Yeah, it's true. You don't have that as much naturally. I think, again, a lot of it goes back to working one-on-one with the director and figuring out, well, what do they want? I worked on a concert documentary recently, and that was a little bit different because in terms of pacing, we knew like the concert portions of the film were going to be sort of like these anchors throughout the movie. But it's more of like a big picture pacing, if that makes sense. Like you have to slow down time, whether it's you cut to a drone shot, there's this beautiful music, and and then you kind of like sit on the shot of a house and it's silent for a moment. Like documentaries are very much about transitioning from one beat to another. And in scripted, you have these scenes, like natural, like there's a scene written, I'm going to have to go from scene 1 to scene 2 to scene 3, and scene 3 doesn't work, I'm going to pull it out. With documentaries, it's very much about creating sequences. So there's very few, like even in that documentary that I'm referring to, there's very few scenes that were shot as scenes. Like there's a scene where she's sitting with her family in the kitchen and talking about, photos and memories. There's a scene where she's behind the scenes after her concert. Like those are scenes. But even within those scenes, you have to insert an interview. Like there has to be a moment where someone reflects upon something that was said in the scene, because it's not written for you. The context is not there. The exposition is not there. You have to insert it. So it's very much about creating that pace, and you have to like find ways to slow down time with a look or with a B-roll shot or, what have you. So it's very much about creating that pacing and creating moments in time that maybe aren't there.
Was that the Mary J. Blige doc? Yes.
Yeah, that was really fun.
Like there is heavy content in there, but did you enjoy cutting her concert stuff?
I did, yeah. I mean, it was fun. It was the first, well, I had done 2 other like dance or like performance type things in the past. But this was like the first true concert documentary. I loved cutting her concert stuff. They had a lot of like slow motion footage that had been shot. They did a beautiful job, capturing it. And she's just so, if anyone's ever been to one of her concerts or seen her on stage, she's so, I don't know what the right word is. Like she just kind of grabs your attention and doesn't let go. Really a beautiful performer.
She gives 110%.
Yeah, totally.
Now I have one last question for you.
Sure.
What would you say is your favorite guilty pleasure film to watch?
This is a really hard question to answer. I am a huge fan of romantic comedies. That would be like my dream, to be able to cut more romantic comedies. And my favorite one growing up was Father of the Bride and Father of the Bride too. So, I mean, I love that brand of humor. I love the story. It reminds me a lot about like my relationship with my dad. So that's just something that, I always go back to. Oh, and My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which I don't think I love that film because that touches on a culture that is very similar to mine. I'm Armenian. So those are 2 films like I could always go back and watch over and over again.
Now, well, Steve Martin also is just hilarious.
Yeah.
So he could, I'll pretty much watch anything he's in. But well, thank you so much for letting me interview you today.
Of course. Thank you for having me. This was really fun.
So that's it for this week. Make sure to check us out at filmmakeru.com, or of course follow us on Twitter at filmmaker_u. I'm Gordon Burkell. Thanks for watching.
Today's episode of Filmmaker U is brought to you by our sponsors OWC. Go to owcdigital.com for all your filmmaking and computer needs. And it's also brought to you by our other sponsors, AJA. Make sure to check out aja.com so that you can see how they can help you in your post-production needs.